January 1945. Germany was losing the war, but this only made the Nazis more brutal. At a station near Auschwitz, under the cover of night, SS officers were loading the final transport of prisoners. Freight car number 447 was one of 20 that made up the death train. Inside, like cattle, over 100 men, women, and children were crammed. Among them were participants of the Warsaw Uprising, Soviet prisoners of war, French resistance fighters, Polish Jews who had survived the camps, and Czech partisans. All were bound for Berlin to be executed as a final act of Nazi vengeance before the Red Army arrived. The cold was murderous. January frost penetrated through the wooden walls of the cattle car. People pressed against each other, trying to survive, their breath forming clouds of vapor that froze on the walls. Among the prisoners was Mikhail Sokolov, a Soviet sapper. Before his capture 3 months ago, he had been part of a demolition unit. His hands were bound with barbed wire that cut into his wrists with every movement. The SS had been especially careful with him. They'd found explosives on him during capture and knew he was dangerous. But they had missed one thing. Hidden in a secret pocket sewn into the lining of his tattered uniform, pressed against his ribs where even the most thorough search hadn't found it, was a single RGD-33 grenade. It had been there for 3 months. Mikhail had protected it like his own life, knowing that someday, somehow, he would use it. That day had come. Next to Mikhail sat Anna Kowalska, a young Polish woman who had been a courier for the resistance. Her face was bruised, evidence of recent interrogation. Her hands were also bound, but not as tightly. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the car, she could see the determination in Mikhail's eyes. "What are you planning?" she whispered in broken Russian. Mikhail looked at her, then at the others crowded in the freezing car. Children crying, old men barely breathing, women with the hollow eyes of those who had seen too much death. "Freedom," he said simply. "For all of us, one way or another." The train lurched forward with a metallic screech that hurt their ears. Through the cracks, they could see the station disappearing into the snowy darkness. The journey to Berlin would take approximately 14 hours if they traveled without stops. But Mikhail knew they wouldn't make it that far. The SS convoy was in the passenger cars at the front and rear of the train. 20 soldiers, all armed, all ready to kill at the first sign of resistance. As the train picked up speed, Mikhail began working his bound hands, ignoring the pain as the barbed wire cut deeper into his flesh. Blood ran down his wrists, freezing in the cold air. He needed to maneuver his body to reach the grenade with his mouth. An old man named Samuel Weiss, a rabbi from Krakow, watched him with knowing eyes. "You'll kill us all," he whispered. Not an accusation, but an understanding. "We're already dead," Mikhail replied. "The only question is whether we die as slaves or as fighters, whether we take some of these bastards with us." The train rocked violently as it took a turn, and people fell against each other. A child screamed. In the chaos, Mikhail managed to twist his body, his face pressed against his own chest, teeth searching for the hidden pocket. In the guard car at the rear, SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber sat smoking, looking at the manifest. 423 prisoners total. By morning, they would all be dead. Shot in the courtyard of Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. Orders from the top leave no witnesses, no survivors who could testify to what had happened in the camps. Klaus felt nothing about this. He had stopped feeling years ago, somewhere between Poland and Ukraine, after the 100th or was it 1000th execution. The faces of the condemned no longer haunted his dreams. He was simply following orders, doing his duty to the Reich. What he didn't know was that among those 423 prisoners were some of the most dangerous people the resistance had produced. People who had nothing left to lose. People who would rather die fighting than arrive meekly at their execution. Back in car number 447, Mikhail's teeth finally found the fabric. He bit down, ignoring the taste of blood and dirt, and began to tear. The stitching was strong, made to last, but his desperation was stronger. Slowly, painfully, the fabric gave way. Anna watched, understanding now what he was doing. She began to whisper to those nearest to them, explaining in Polish, then German, then Yiddish. The words spread through the car like fire through dry grass. "The Russian has a grenade. He's going to blow up the train." Reactions varied. Some were horrified. Others nodded slowly, accepting. A few smiled grimly, better to die in fire than by bullet. Better to take the enemy with them. A young boy, no more than 12, crawled closer to Mikhail. His name was David, and he had survived 2 years in the camps by being clever and quick. "When you pull the pin," he whispered, "how long do we have?" Mikhail paused in his work, looking at the boy with respect. "Smart question. 4 to 5 seconds. Maybe less in this cold. Enough time to throw it toward the guard car? If someone's hands were free, yes." David looked at his own bound wrists, then at Anna's. "Her bindings are loose. I saw the SS guard didn't tie them properly. He was drunk." Anna tested her bonds. David was right. With effort, painful effort, she might be able to slip her hands free. But that would take time they didn't have. The train was picking up speed now, racing through the Polish countryside. Through the cracks, they could see small villages, dark and silent under the snow. People who knew what these trains carried but could do nothing to stop them. Mikhail's teeth finally closed around something hard and cold. The grenade. He began to pull it free, his neck muscles screaming with the effort, vertebrae crackling. Blood from his cut wrists had frozen in streaks on his arms. In the front guard car, SS Oberscharführer Heinrich Richter checked his rifle for the 3rd time. Unlike Weber, Heinrich still felt fear. He had been in Russia, had seen what the partisans could do, how they could turn a simple transport into a massacre. He trusted nothing and no one. "Something's wrong," he said to the soldier next to him. "What?" "It's too quiet. 400 prisoners and I can't hear anything. No crying, no praying, nothing." The other soldier laughed. "They're frozen. Half of them probably dead already. Saves us bullets." But Heinrich couldn't shake the feeling. He stood up, grabbed his rifle, and headed toward the cattle cars. "I'm going to check." That decision would save his life and haunt him forever. Back in car number 447, Mikhail had the grenade in his mouth, held carefully between his teeth. The metal was so cold it burned his lips, but he didn't dare drop it. One wrong move, and they would all die right here, right now, accomplishing nothing. Anna had been working on her bindings, blood lubricating her wrists, making them slippery. The barbed wire cut deep, but she ignored the pain. She had survived worse. She had endured interrogation, torture, had watched her family die. This pain was nothing. With a final agonizing pull, her right hand slipped free. The wire had torn open her wrist to the bone, but she was free. "Now," Mikhail said around the grenade, his voice muffled, "take it, carefully." Anna reached out with trembling, bloody hands and took the grenade from his mouth. It was heavier than she expected, and so cold. She could see the pin, still in place, waiting. Rabbi Weiss began to pray in Hebrew, ancient words that had been spoken in times of tribulation for thousands of years. Others joined him, their voices creating a strange harmony in the freezing car. "When I open the door," Mikhail said, "you throw it toward the guard car. Aim for the connection between the cars. The explosion will separate us from them." "And then?" Anna asked, though she already knew the answer. "And then we jump into the snow. Some of us will die from the fall, but some will survive. And those who survive will be free." Heinrich had just reached car number 447 when he heard it singing. The prisoners were singing. A Russian song, defiant and strong, voices rising above the sound of the train. His blood ran cold. Singing meant rebellion. Singing meant they had hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing a prisoner could have. He grabbed the lock on the car door, fumbling with the keys. He had to stop whatever was happening inside. Had to. The door burst open from the inside. A woman with wild eyes and blood-covered hands stood there, and in her hands was something that made Heinrich's combat instincts scream in warning. Grenade! Anna pulled the pin with her teeth, just as Mikhail had planned. 4 seconds, maybe 5. She saw the SS guard, saw his eyes widen in terror and recognition, saw him start to raise his rifle. She threw the grenade with all her strength, not at the guard, but past him, toward the connection between the cars where the rest of the convoy sat, unaware. Then Mikhail was there, using his body as a shield, pushing her back into the car and down. "Everyone down! Cover your heads!" Heinrich ran. He had been a soldier for 6 years, had survived the Eastern Front, had developed instincts that kept him alive. Those instincts screamed at him now to run, to get away, to... The explosion was deafening. The grenade detonated exactly where Anna had aimed it, at the coupling between car Neimer 447 and the rest of the train. The force of the blast ripped through the connection, severing the cattle cars from the passenger cars that held the main SS convoy. But that wasn't all. The explosion ruptured a fuel line that fed the train's heating system. The spilled fuel ignited instantly in the freezing air, creating a wall of fire that spread with terrifying speed. In car Neimer 447, the prisoners felt the impact, felt their car separate from the rest of the train. The momentum carried them forward while the front half of the train, with the engine and the guard cars, continued on, disappearing into the night. "Now!" Mikhail shouted. "Jump! Everyone who can. Jump! Now!" The door was open, and beyond it was darkness and snow and freedom. People didn't hesitate. They threw themselves out into the night, into the snowdrifts that rushed past, some landing safely, others breaking bones, a few dying instantly. Anna grabbed David, the young boy, and together they jumped, hitting the snow hard and rolling. The world spun around them in a chaos of white and black and cold. Behind them, the other cattle cars, still connected to each other, but separated from the engine, began to slow down. And the fire was spreading, consuming car after car, turning the night into day. Inside those cars, hundreds of other prisoners realized what was happening. Some managed to break open their doors from the inside. Others weren't as lucky, trapped as the flames consumed everything. The front half of the train, with the engine and the main SS convoy, didn't realize what had happened for almost a full minute. By the time Klaus Weber looked back and saw the wall of fire lighting up the night behind them, by the time he ordered the emergency stop, it was too late. The rear half of the train, 17 cars full of prisoners and fire, had become something else. It had become a funeral pyre. But it had also become a monument to resistance, visible for miles around, announcing to the frozen Polish countryside that some people would rather die in flames than submit to tyranny. Heinrich Richter, thrown clear by the explosion, lay in the snow 50 meters from the tracks. His uniform was on fire, his face burned, his hearing gone, but he was alive. He watched his train burn, watched it light up the night sky, watched as small figures ran from it in all directions. Prisoners, escaping into the darkness. He could have shot them. His rifle was still in his hands. But he didn't. He just lay there in the snow, watching his war end in fire and failure. Mikhail helped Anna to her feet. Around them, survivors were gathering, maybe 40, maybe 50 people who had made it out of the cars before the fire consumed everything. They were wounded, freezing, but they were free. "Which way?" someone asked. Mikhail looked at the stars, at the position of the fire, calculating. East, toward the Red Army. They're close now. We can make it if we move fast. Rabbi Weiss, somehow still alive, his beard singed and his coat smoking, put a hand on Mikhail's shoulder. "You saved us." "I killed us all," Mikhail replied, looking at the burning train. "And I'd do it again." As they began to move into the forest, Anna looked back one last time at the train that never reached Berlin. In the firelight, she could see something impossible shadows moving in the flames, not away from them, but through them. The shapes of people who hadn't made it out. who had died in the fire, but who seemed to be walking now with purpose, with peace. She blinked, and they were gone. Just tricks of light and smoke and trauma. But she would remember that vision for the rest of her life. Would remember and wonder if perhaps death in fire, death in resistance, granted a kind of peace that death by execution never could. The survivors disappeared into the forest, and behind them, Train 447 burned through the night, a beacon that could be seen from villages dozens of kilometers away. The Nazis would report it as a partisan attack. The partisans would claim it as a victory. But the truth was simpler and more powerful. One man with a grenade and nothing left to lose had changed the fate of dozens, perhaps hundreds, had proven that even in the darkest hour, even in the grip of absolute evil, resistance was possible. The train burned until dawn, and when the SS finally sent troops to investigate, they found only ash and twisted metal, and the frozen bodies of those who hadn't escaped in time. They never found Mikhail Sokolov, or Anna Kowalska, or young David, or any of the 47 survivors who made it to the forest. Those survivors would later tell their story to Soviet investigators, to Allied forces, to anyone who would listen. But there were parts of that night they could never fully explain. The shadows they saw in the flames, the feeling that they weren't alone as they ran through the forest, the sense that others, the dead, were running with them, guiding them, protecting them. And there was one more mystery that would never be solved. Heinrich Richter, the SS guard who survived the explosion, would spend the rest of his life telling a story that no one believed. He claimed that in the moment before the grenade exploded, he had looked into Anna Kowalska's eyes and seen not just a woman, but hundreds of faces. All the people who had died on these trains, all the victims of the camps, all looking at him with judgment and fury. He would die in a Soviet prison camp in 1951, still haunted by those eyes, still whispering about the ghost train that never reached Berlin. The forest was ancient and dark, the kind of primeval woodland that had existed long before nations drew their borders across Europe. The survivors moved through it like ghosts themselves, leaving tracks in the snow that would tell their story to anyone who followed. Mikhail led them east, using the North Star as his guide. His wrists were still bound with barbed wire that had cut to the bone, but he didn't stop to remove it. There would be time for that later, if they survived. Right now, every second counted. Behind them, they could still see the orange glow of the burning train lighting up the night sky. And they could hear something else, dogs. The SS had brought tracking dogs, and those dogs were already on their scent. "We need to split up," Anna said, her breath creating clouds of vapor in the freezing air. "If we stay together, they'll find us all." "No," Mikhail replied firmly. "We stay together, alone, in this cold, without supplies. We'll die within hours. Together, we have a chance." Rabbi Weiss, despite his age, was keeping up with the younger survivors. "The boy is right. There's a village, maybe 5 kilometers east. I knew this area before the war. We might find help there, or we might find Wehrmacht soldiers," someone muttered. "Then we die fighting," Mikhail said simply. "Better than freezing in the forest." Young David, the 12-year-old who had helped plan the escape, was walking beside Anna. His feet were wrapped in rags. The SS had taken his shoes months ago, but he didn't complain. "How many do you think made it out?" he asked. Anna looked back at the group. In the darkness, it was hard to count, but she estimated around 40 survivors. "Not enough," she said quietly, "but more than would have made it to Berlin." What Anna didn't say, what none of them could bring themselves to say, was that many of those who had jumped from the train were probably dead, broken necks from the fall, freezing in the snow before they could get up, or simply too weak to move after months of starvation and abuse. But 47 had made it to the forest. 47 souls who refused to die quietly. As they walked, strange things began to happen. People started reporting that they could hear voices in the wind, not German or Russian, but something older, something that predated the war. The trees seemed to lean toward them, as if offering shelter. And more than one person swore they saw figures moving parallel to them through the forest, keeping pace but never coming close enough to identify. "Ghosts," whispered a Polish woman named Maria. She had been a teacher before the war, before they took her to Ravensbrück for hiding Jewish children. "The forest is full of ghosts. So many have died here." "There are no ghosts," Mikhail said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen too much in this war. Too many impossible things to be certain of anything anymore. The sound of the dogs was getting closer. The SS were organized, efficient. They knew how to track, how to hunt, and they would show no mercy when they caught up. That's when Rabbi Weiss stopped walking and turned to face the others. "Go ahead," he said calmly. "I'll slow them down." "No," Anna protested. "We don't leave anyone behind." The old rabbi smiled, and in the moonlight filtering through the trees, his face seemed to glow with an inner peace. "My child, I'm 73 years old. I've watched my entire family die. My synagogue burned. My community destroyed. I've lived longer than I ever expected to in these dark times. But you," he looked at David, at Anna, at the younger survivors, "you have years ahead of you, lives to rebuild, stories to tell. Don't waste my sacrifice." Before anyone could stop him, Rabbi Weiss turned and began walking back toward the sound of the dogs, singing a Hebrew prayer in a strong, clear voice that carried through the frozen forest. Mikhail grabbed Anna's arm as she tried to follow. "No, we honor his choice by surviving. Move." They ran then, really ran. Despite their exhaustion, despite their injuries, behind them, they heard the rabbi's voice grow louder, heard the dogs reach him, heard the brief burst of gunfire that ended his song. But his sacrifice bought them precious time. The SS stopped to investigate, and in those minutes, the survivors gained distance, found a frozen stream that would hide their scent, followed it deeper into the forest. They walked through that stream, ice water soaking through their rags, for almost a kilometer before Mikhail allowed them to climb out on the far bank. By then, 3 more people had collapsed from cold and exhaustion, unable to continue. They were left where they fell, with whispered prayers and promises to return for them if survival proved possible. The survivors numbered 44 now. As dawn approached, turning the sky from black to gray, they finally saw it. The village Rabbi Weiss had mentioned. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lights glowed in windows. It looked like something from a fairy tale, impossible and beautiful after the horrors they had endured. But was it safe? Would the villagers help them or turn them over to the Germans? "I'll go first," Mikhail said. "If it's a trap, the rest of you run." "I'm coming with you," Anna insisted. "You're not doing this alone." They approached the village carefully, 2 scarecrow figures emerging from the forest, covered in blood and ice and ash. The first person they encountered was an old woman drawing water from a well. She took one look at them and dropped her bucket. For a terrible moment, they thought she would scream, would alert the authorities. Instead, she rushed toward them, wrapping her shawl around Anna's shoulders. "Quickly," she whispered in Polish. "The Germans patrol through here. Come with me." She led them not to her house, but to a barn at the edge of the village. Inside, in the hayloft, she had a hidden space where she'd been sheltering resistance fighters for months. "How many are you?" she asked. 44, Mikhail replied. "Escaped from a transport train. We need food, shelter, medical supplies." The old woman's eyes widened. 44. Impossible. The whole village will see. The Germans will know. "Then we'll move on," Anna said, though the thought of going back into that frozen forest made her want to weep. "We won't endanger you." But the old woman was already thinking, her mind working through possibilities. "No. Wait here. I'll gather the others, the ones who can be trusted. We'll figure something out." She was back within the hour, accompanied by 3 other villagers, a doctor, a priest, and a farmer. Together, they hatched a plan. The survivors would be hidden in various locations throughout the village, never more than 5 or 6 in one place. The doctor would treat their injuries quietly. The priest would provide false papers when possible. And the farmer, who had connections with the local partisans, would arrange transport toward the Soviet lines. It would take time. It would be dangerous. But it was a chance. As the survivors were being distributed to their hiding places, young David pulled Anna aside. "Did you see them?" he asked quietly. "See what?" "In the forest. The people walking beside us. I thought I was imagining it at first, but I wasn't, was I?" Anna looked at the boy, at his old young eyes that had seen far too much. She could lie, could tell him it was just shadows and exhaustion, but he deserved the truth. "I saw them too," she admitted. "I don't know what they were. Maybe ghosts, maybe angels, maybe just our hope taking form in the darkness. Does it matter?" David thought about this. "No," he finally said. "I guess it doesn't. They helped us. That's what matters." Over the next week, the villagers risked everything to help the survivors. The doctor treated frostbite, infections, and wounds that should have killed people but somehow didn't. The priest forged documents. The farmer made contact with partisan groups operating in the area. But the Nazis weren't giving up. They knew prisoners had escaped, and they were systematic in their search. Village after village was being raided, houses burned, hostages taken. On the 8th day, German trucks rolled into the village just after dawn. The survivors had minutes to prepare. Those who could fight grabbed whatever weapons the villagers had been able to provide: hunting rifles, old pistols, knives, axes. The others hid in cellars, in attics, behind false walls that had been hastily constructed. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber was leading the search personally. He had been humiliated by the escape, had lost over 400 prisoners, and his superiors were demanding answers. He would find those prisoners, and he would make an example of them and anyone who would help them. He stood in the village square, watching his men go door to door, and something caught his eye. Boot prints in the snow, too many of them, all recent, all heading to and from the old church. He smiled coldly. Hiding in a church. How predictable. Klaus led a squad of 10 men toward the church, rifles ready. They burst through the doors to find the priest standing at the altar, calmly lighting candles. "Where are they?" Klaus demanded in German. The priest, who understood German perfectly, pretended not to comprehend. He continued his work, ignoring the soldiers. Klaus walked up to him and pressed his pistol against the priest's temple. "I'll ask one more time. Where are the escaped prisoners?" The priest finally looked at him, and Klaus saw no fear in those eyes, only pity. "You're too late," the priest said in perfect German. "They're already gone, moved on 3 days ago. You'll never find them." Klaus didn't believe him. He had his men search the church, tearing up floorboards, checking every possible hiding spot. They found nothing. What Klaus didn't know was that the priest was telling a half-truth. Most of the survivors had indeed been moved to a different location 3 days ago, taken by partisan guides deeper into the forest. But 7 remained in the village, too injured to travel, hidden in a secret cellar beneath the church that the Germans hadn't found. Among those 7 were Mikhail and Anna. They lay in the darkness below, listening to the Germans tear apart the space above them, hearing the priest's calm voice answering questions, hearing the frustration in Klaus Weber's commands. "If they're gone, then you're useless to me," Klaus finally said. The gunshot echoed through the church. Anna pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle her sob. Another death. Another sacrifice. How many more before this nightmare ended? But the priest's death served a purpose. Convinced that the prisoners had indeed moved on, Klaus ordered his men to expand their search to the surrounding area. The village was left with only a token guard of 3 soldiers. That night, those 3 soldiers were found with their throats cut. The work of partisans, people would later say, But the survivors knew the truth. It was Mikhail, moving through the darkness like a ghost himself, doing what needed to be done. By dawn, the survivors were being led out of the village by partisan guides, moving through secret paths toward the Soviet lines, still days away but getting closer with every step. 41 remained now. Rabbi Weiss had sacrificed himself. The priest had given his life. 3 had died from their injuries, despite the doctor's care. But 41 souls were still free, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the darkness that threatened to consume Europe. As they left the village behind, Anna turned to Mikhail. His face was hard, haunted by the things he'd had to do, the lives he'd had to take. Was it worth it? She asked quietly. All of this death, just to save ourselves? Mikhail looked at her, then at the other survivors. David, walking tall, despite his exhaustion. Maria, teaching a younger woman how to identify edible plants. A Soviet soldier named Yuri, sharing his meager rations with an elderly Polish man. Yes, he said finally, because we're not just saving ourselves, we're saving the truth, the testimony, the proof that not everyone went quietly to their deaths. That matters, Anna. They walked through the day and into the next night, guided by partisans who knew these forests like their own skin. And as they walked, they continued to see them. The shadow figures that paced them through the trees, that seemed to scout ahead, that appeared whenever danger was near. On the 3rd day, they heard something that made their hearts race. Russian voices, artillery in the distance. The Red Army was close, so close. They pushed forward with renewed energy. And just before sunset, they saw them. Soviet soldiers, advancing through the forest, liberating village after village as they pushed toward Berlin. The survivors stumbled out of the tree line, hands raised, shouting, in Russian, in Polish, in Yiddish, identifying themselves. The Soviet soldiers stared at them in disbelief. Prisoners, escaped from a death transport, having survived for 11 days in the frozen wilderness. It seemed impossible. But Mikhail still had the barbed wire cutting into his wrists, proof of where they'd come from. Anna still had the scars from her escape, and all of them carried the marks of the camps, the tattoos, the trauma, the evidence of the horror they'd survived. A Soviet officer, a major with kind eyes and a weathered face, listened to their story with increasing amazement. When Mikhail described the grenade, the explosion, the burning train, the major shook his head in wonder. "You're the train," he said. "The Phantom Train. We've been hearing reports for days. The Germans say it was a partisan attack, but villagers have been telling a different story. They say it was divine intervention. They say the train was carrying souls who refused to die, who burned with such fury that the fire itself became holy." "It wasn't divine intervention," Mikhail said tiredly. "It was one grenade and a lot of luck." The major smiled. "Perhaps. Or perhaps sometimes, in the darkest moments, one grenade is all God needs." The survivors were taken to a field hospital, fed, treated, given clean clothes and warm beds. For the first time in months, some of them in years, they were safe. But that night, as Anna lay in her bed, she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the burning train, kept hearing Rabbi Weiss's song, kept remembering the shadow figures in the forest. She got up and walked outside, needing air. Young David was there, sitting on a crate, looking at the stars. "Can't sleep either?" Anna asked. He shook his head. "I keep thinking about the others, the ones who didn't make it out, the ones in the other cars who burned. Do you think they found peace?" Anna sat beside him, this child who had become old before his time. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think maybe the fire set them free. Not just their bodies, but their spirits. I think that's who we saw in the forest. The ones who died in the flames, walking beside us, making sure we made it to safety. You really believe that? I want to believe it. I need to believe that their deaths meant something, that the fire that took them also transformed them, made them into something more than victims. They sat in silence for a while, watching the night sky, watching the distant flashes of artillery as the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. March 1945. The war was in its final weeks, though no one knew that yet. The survivors of Train 447 had been separated, sent to different units, different camps, different futures. But the story of the burning train had spread, growing with each retelling, becoming legend. Mikhail Sokolov was back with a Soviet demolition unit, training new sappers. But he wasn't the same man who had boarded that death transport. He barely spoke now, haunted by the faces of those who didn't make it, by the weight of the lives he'd saved and the lives he'd failed to save. Anna Kowalska had joined the Polish People's Army, refusing to sit idle while her country was still occupied. She wore the scars from the barbed wire on her wrists like badges of honor, reminders of the night she had held death in her hands and thrown it at tyranny. Young David, no one knew his last name, it had been lost in the chaos of the camps, was with a group of orphaned children being cared for by Soviet nurses. But at night he would sneak out and sit by the fire with the soldiers, listening to them tell stories, absorbing everything, remembering. Because David had decided something in that forest, in those terrible days of flight and fear, he would survive not just to live, but to remember, to testify, to make sure the world never forgot what had happened to his people, to all the people who had ridden those death trains. But there was something else happening, something that none of the survivors talked about openly, but all of them felt. The train was still burning. Not physically, the wreckage had long since cooled, been cleared away by German troops trying to hide the evidence. But spiritually, metaphysically, in some dimension beyond the physical world, Train 447 was still burning, still traveling, carrying souls that refused to be forgotten. Soviet soldiers advancing through Poland began reporting strange sightings. A burning train that appeared on abandoned rail lines at night, its cars full of passengers who waved and smiled before vanishing into smoke. Villagers spoke of hearing train whistles where no tracks existed, of seeing shadows moving through the trees in formations that matched the groups of escaped prisoners. The stories reached all the way to Moscow, where Soviet intelligence officers documented them not as supernatural phenomena, but as evidence of mass trauma, collective hallucination, brought on by the horrors of war. But one officer, a major in the NKVD named Dmitry Volkov, wasn't so sure. He had been collecting reports of anomalous events related to the train for weeks, and the pattern was too consistent to dismiss. He requested permission to interview the survivors, to compile a complete record of what had happened. He started with Mikhail, finding him at a training camp outside Warsaw. They met in a small office, snow falling outside the window, two soldiers who had seen too much sitting across a table from each other. "Tell me about the grenade," Volkov said, notepad ready. Mikhail looked at him with tired eyes. "I've already given my report." "I know. I've read it 3 times. But I want to hear it from you directly. Not the official version. The truth." Something in Volkov's tone made Mikhail pause. This wasn't a standard debriefing. This was something else. "What do you really want to know?" Mikhail asked. "I want to know about the shadows. The figures in the forest. Multiple survivors have mentioned them, but no one will speak about them on the record. Why?" Mikhail was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Because speaking about them makes them real. And if they're real, then everything." Mikhail was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Because speaking about them makes them real. And if they're real, then we have to accept that the dead aren't really gone, that they're still fighting, still with us." Volkov leaned forward. "And you believe they were real?" "I don't know what I believe anymore. But I know what I saw. Hundreds of figures, moving through the trees, keeping pace with us, always there when we needed guidance, when we were lost. They led us away from German patrols twice. Once, they appeared, and we changed direction, and minutes later, We heard trucks on the road. We would have crossed. Guardian angels? Mikhail laughed bitterly. Angels? In a world that built Auschwitz? No. I think they were the ones who died in the fire, the ones we couldn't save. And I think they refused to rest until we made it to safety. Volkov interviewed Anna next, finding her in a field hospital where she was recovering from a minor wound. She told him the same story, with the same haunted certainty. The train is still burning, she said. I see it sometimes, when I close my eyes. Not a memory, a vision. It's traveling somewhere between life and death, carrying all the souls who died on those tracks. And one day, it will reach Berlin. Not the physical Berlin, but something else. A reckoning. You sound like a mystic, Volkov said, not unkindly. I sound like someone who held a live grenade and threw it at death itself. After that, Major, mysticism doesn't seem so strange. By April, Volkov had interviewed 37 of the 41 survivors. 4 couldn't be found lost in the chaos of war's end, perhaps dead. Perhaps simply vanished. His report was hundreds of pages long, filled with testimonies that defied rational explanation but were too consistent to dismiss. The report was classified immediately. Too dangerous, the commissars said. Too likely to encourage religious thinking, supernatural beliefs, things that had no place in the Soviet worldview. But Volkov kept a copy, and years later, after Stalin's death, after the thaw, he would publish parts of it as a book. The Train That Never Reached Berlin became a bestseller in the Soviet Union, a story of resistance and survival that inspired a generation. The last chapter of his book dealt with something he could never prove but couldn't ignore. The theory that Train 447 had become something more than metal and fire, that it had become a psychic way station for the dead, a place where souls in transition could find rest before moving on. He documented dozens of reports from the post-war years, concentration camp survivors who saw the burning train in their dreams and woke up feeling peace for the first time. Children of the murdered who reported visions of their parents waving from the windows of a train made of light. Even some former SS guards who, before their executions, claimed to see the train coming for them, flames burning with the fury of justice. 44 years after the train burned, David Stein stood in Berlin on the night the wall came down. He was 56 years old now, a professor of Holocaust studies, a father, a grandfather. But part of him was still that 12-year-old boy who had jumped from a death train into the snow. The crowd around him was celebrating. People climbing on the wall, hammering at it with whatever tools they could find. The Cold War was ending. Germany would be reunified. A new era was beginning. But David wasn't looking at the wall. He was looking at the railway tracks nearby, the old freight lines that ran through Berlin. And he was remembering. Anna Kowalska found him there. She was 72 now, her hair white, her body bent by arthritis. But her eyes still burned with that same defiant fire. You feel it too? She asked in Polish. The train, David replied. It's finally arriving. They stood together, 2 survivors, and watched as something impossible happened. The air above the tracks began to shimmer, to glow. And then, appearing like a mirage, they saw it. Train 447, burning with flames that didn't consume, filled with passengers who waved and smiled. The train that never reached Berlin had finally arrived. Other survivors were there too, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Mikhail Sokolov, 78 years old, using a cane, but standing straight. Maria Novak, the teacher. Yuri Petrov, the Soviet soldier. All the ones who had lived, who had carried the memory and the burden for 44 years. And standing on the platform of the phantom train, as clear as if he were alive, was Rabbi Weiss, young again, whole again, smiling with tears of joy running down his face. It's over, Anna whispered. The journey is complete. The train began to fade, its passengers waving one final time. But as it disappeared, something changed in the survivors. The weight they'd carried for decades, the survivors' guilt, the nightmares, The wondering why they had lived when so many had died suddenly lifted. They understood now. They had been spared not randomly, but with purpose, to tell the story, to bear witness, to ensure that the dead were remembered not just as victims, but as fighters who had chosen fire over submission. David looked at Anna, and for the first time in 44 years, both of them smiled without shadows. "We did it," he said. "We remembered them. We told their story, and now they can rest," Anna replied. Around them, Berlin celebrated its reunification, unaware of the miracle that had just occurred on the old freight tracks. But the survivors knew. The train had completed its journey. The souls had found peace. Mikhail raised his cane in salute to the empty tracks. "To the ones who didn't make it," he said, his voice strong despite his age, "may you find in death the freedom you were denied in life. And may we live well enough," Anna added, "to honor your sacrifice." They stood there until dawn. The survivors of Train 447, watching the sunrise over a new Berlin, a free Berlin, knowing that somewhere beyond the veil of reality, a train was finally pulling into its station, its passengers disembarking into a light that promised rest and redemption. The train that never reached Berlin had, in the end, arrived exactly where it needed to be.